Нічого страшного, може пізніше.
Hello?
Yes, we're going to start in a minute.
Okay, very good, very good.
Ні, не зовсім.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of our partners, the Gorshenian Institute, LB.ua, we are pleased to welcome you this morning to what I think will be a very thought-provoking and interesting discussion. My name is Myron Basilik. I'm the Director for International Cooperation at the Growford Institute, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Before we turn to our key speaker, I do want to use a few minutes of your time to cover some organizational procedures so that we are all on the same page in terms of what to expect and how to participate. So first, the talk will be in English and Ukrainian with simultaneous translation. To hear the translation, please press on the globe icon on the bottom of your screen and choose the language. The language is either English or Ukrainian. Unfortunately, you have to choose the Russian channel to hear Ukrainian, so it's one of those small things. Anyway, second, we have a lineup of 6 speakers, after which we will open up the floor for questions and a discussion. As the moderator, I will give everybody, I will introduce everybody and facilitate the flow of the discussion. Thirdly, if you would like to pose a question after our discussants, please raise your hand in the gallery, and then we will give you the chance to pose your question. Fourth, and not least important, is that the discussion will last 90 minutes. We ask that everybody be succinct, and that because there are many that may want to ask questions. So please be frank and friendly to others. Also curious, who is in the room? As to who's in the room, or who's in the gallery, we have a number of invited guests from the Ministry of Finance, the National Bank of Ukraine, various academic and institutions of higher learning, as well as representatives from think tanks, NGOs, trade associations, diplomatic missions, and private business. So welcome to all. That ends the introduction. Moving forward, for those unfamiliar with Growford, it is an independent, non-governmental think tank that undertakes global research in the areas of finance, economics, and trade. We assess systematic risks and recommend optimal public and private policies to government officials for economic development and growth in Ukraine and throughout the region. With that mission in mind, Growford is very honored to have as our headliner this morning Lord Edeir Terner, author of the book Between Debt and the Devil. Lord Terner was chairman of Britain's Financial Services Authority just as the global financial crisis struck in 2008. He played a key role in redesigning global financial regulation, which led to the crisis. His book sets the record straight about what actually caused the crisis and the financial overhang, or hangover as we say in the United States. And lo and behold, it's human addiction to private debt, which is to blame for the crisis and its long overhang for consumers throughout developed markets. What I enjoyed most about the book was the historical parallels going back to 19th century Britain, as well as financial policies and regulations during the early 20th century in the United States, and of course the post-World War II economies in Western Europe, Japan, Korea, Indonesia, China, and others. A true masterpiece of comparison, yet at the same time an examination of fundamentals necessary for a well-functioning financial system that facilitates economic growth and individual prosperity, excuse me. But I'm not the only one that enjoyed the book. Growford's founder, Vitaly Lomachovich, who is to my left, liked the book so much that he bought the copyright from Princeton University and had the book translated into Ukrainian. When I spoke to Vitaly over the summer, he told me I must read the book because it provided the underpinnings of what Ukraine should do to foster economic growth. And in my work with the Institute, he said one of my first tasks was to arrange Lord Terner's personal or virtual lecture in Kyiv. So I'm happy to report I've not only read the book, but also we have Lord Terner with us today. So with that short introduction, let me turn to Growford's founder, Vitaly Lomachovich. Vitaly, why is the book so important to you, and what is it that you see in this book that is so important for Ukraine and policymakers?
Thank you, Bruno. Dear our participants, I am very happy to see all of you here today, and especially I very appreciate to Sir Edeիր Terner, who kindly agreed join with us today, and we will talk about his book Debt and Devil. Let me in a few words continue my short speech in the Ukrainian language. Thank you. Ну, чому це важливо було перекласти цю книжку? Вона насправді є дуже актуальною і для України 2019 року, коли ми це зробили, і для України 2020 року, яка зараз отримала, так як майже весь світ, виклики, які пов'язані з пандемією COVID-19. Тому ті тези, які виклав сер Тернер в своїй книжці, вони є актуальними, дуже актуальними зараз. І я сподіваюся, що і представники Національного банку, які, на жаль, сповідують трошки іншу таку докризову доктрину приготування інфляції і скажімо так, пом'якшення, не проведення монетарного пом'якшення шляхом викупу державних цінних паперів на вторинному ринку, напевно, краще зрозуміють, які зараз нові течії вже існують там буквально з 2009 року в світовій монетарній політиці в світі, для того, щоб краще цим викликам відповідати. Тому я сподіваюся, що ця презентація, після цієї презентації інтерес до книги пана Тернера значно зросте, і ми з радістю сьогодні презентуємо ті речі, ті тези, які ми хотіли би донести нашому загалу, експертному середовищу, які викладені в цій книзі пана Тернера.
Thank you very much, Vitaly. Let me just turn the floor over to our main speaker today, but before I do that, I just want to say that how things will flow. First, we'll have Lord Terner. Afterwards, we will have the Finance Minister of Ukraine, Sергій Marčenko, will be a discussant after Lord Terner. Thirdly, we will have a member of Parliament, member of the Committee on Anti-Corruption Policies, Mr. Олексій Жмеринецький. And our third discussant will be Dr. Tetyana Bogdan from the Growford Institute, after which we will open up the floor for discussion, and we will be willing and able and look forward to your questions. So, let me move now to Lord Terner. Lord Terner has had a distinguished career in business, government, and in the sector of public policy ideas. He began his career at British Petroleum, that small British company, later moving to Chase Manhattan Bank, McKinsey & Company, and was the Director General of the Confederation of British Industry, and finally Vice Chairman of Merrill Lynch. In government, he led the Committee for Climate Change and the Financial Services Authority. And in 2012, he joined the Institute for New Economic Thinking, where he wrote his book, Between Debt and the Devil. So without further ado, let me turn the Zoom microphone over to Lord Terner. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. We're very glad to have you in Ukraine. Lord Terner.
Well, thank you very much.
Okay.
And I'm glad I've been able to sort out a few technical details to be with you. I hope clearly visible online, and I wish I was able to be with you in person. It's a great pleasure to have had my book, Between Debt and the Devil, now translated into Ukrainian, and I would like to thank Mr. Lomakovich for the initiative in doing that. I would like now to describe some key features of the arguments I put forward in the book, and I will try at the end to think about how that might relate to the Ukrainian current experience, though I am very aware that I'm not at all an expert in the macroeconomic or microeconomic challenges you face there. The initial trigger for the writing the book was the global financial crisis of 2008, which was an experience for me which was both very challenging and very exciting, and for a time quite frightening. I actually became the chair of the UK Financial Services Authority on September the 20th, 2008, which was precisely 5 days after the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And I became chair of our Financial Services Authority as the entire global financial system was in a process of collapse. I have sometimes described it as being like being appointed captain of the Titanic ship after you've hit the iceberg, but before you've actually sunk, because it certainly felt like the global financial system was about to sink at that stage. So part of my initial motivation of writing the book, once we had got through the immediate crisis, was to reflect on the causes of the crisis of 2008. And many of those causes were internal to the financial system itself, though rooted in what I believe were incredibly simplistic and misleading economic theories. Ahead of the crisis, there was a very strong theory rooted in neoclassical economics that complete liberalization of financial markets was bound to create greater economic efficiency. So if you look at the writings of many economists and indeed of experts at the IMF in the 8 years or so before 2008, you will see lots of descriptions of why the new model of a financial intermediation with origination and distribution away from bank balance sheets, the development of shadow banking, the use of derivatives, the use of sophisticated value at risk models. You'll see many descriptions of why that was bound to make the financial system a more efficient system for allocating capital to investment needs. And what I realized was that most of that theory was profoundly wrong, and that the proliferation of trading activities, of derivatives, of complicated ways of originating credit and then distributing it through multiple chains of intermediation, far from making the financial system safer, has made it much more unstable. And so part of the book, and in particular chapters 1 and 2 of the book, are about those mistaken theories of financial liberalization and what was wrong with that. And a lot of my life from 2008 to 13 was engaged in the process of re-regulation at a global level to create a more stable financial system which would not suffer an internally generated crisis like 2008. And those reforms included tighter controls on trading activity, tighter controls on derivatives, much larger capital ratios required in banks. And I think those helped create what is today a much more stable financial system than existed before 2008. So I do not anticipate that we will suffer anytime soon a financial crisis within the guts of the global financial system, anything like what occurred in 2008. But as we moved out of the immediate crisis of 2008 and created a more stable financial system, it became apparent to me that beyond the details of the financial system, there were some more fundamental macroeconomic challenges facing the global economy, which lay behind the financial crisis of 2008, and in particular, the very slow recovery after it. And those macroeconomic, rather than purely financial issues, relate to the fundamental nature of money and credit creation and debt. And to address them, I found that I had to return to some basics of economic theory about the nature of money and credit, which had also been largely ignored in pre-crisis neoclassical economics. One of the key factors which I note in the book is the extraordinary increase in the amount of debt, but specifically of private debt, which occurred between, for instance, 1950 and 2007 on the eve of the crisis. As set out, for instance, in Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff's book, on this time it's a different 8 centuries of financial folly, they describe the way that private credit as a percent of GDP in the advanced economies grew from 50% of GDP in 1950 to 170% by 2007. And work by economists such as Alan Taylor and Oscar Yorda has identified that almost all of this credit growth was not extended to finance new capital investment in the productive economy, but was extended to finance the purchase of real estate, and primarily real estate that already existed, with the value of real estate continuing to increase, and in particular the value of land. A very large part of the role of a banking system in advanced economies is not the role described by our economic textbooks of taking savings and putting them into productive investment. It is about lubricating a competition between individuals and companies for the ownership of scarce real estate. To a surprising extent, that is what it does. So there was this very large build-up of debt, which is somewhat detached from the process of productive investment in the real economy. And that build-up of private debt, along with the specific features of the financial system itself, helped create the crisis of 2008, but even more importantly, helped create the difficult situation in which we found ourselves after the crisis, the situation which in chapters 3 and 4 and 5 of the book I describe as the debt hangover or the debt overhang. Once you have created a very large amount of private debt secured against real estate in an economy, and if you have a financial crisis, you can enter an environment in which the private sector is determined to pay down that debt, to save money to pay down that debt. And the attempt of the private sector to do that pushes the economy into a deflationary depression in which there is inadequate demand. And that is what happened after 2008 and the advanced economies. And what is interesting macroeconomically, and what I describe in chapters 3, 4, and 5, is that in that environment, monetary policy becomes ineffective. Because in that environment, interest rates fall to the zero, to what central banks call the zero lower bound, and they are no longer effective at stimulating demand. Short-term policy interest rates were cut to zero, long-term rates fell to zero and were pushed down even more by quantitative easing. But if interest rates are already very low, the impact of additional cuts in interest rates on the economy is very limited. And in that environment, it turns out that the only thing which will keep the global economy going and the advanced economy going is large public deficits. And indeed, that was agreed at the London G20 meeting in April 2009, that the major advanced economies must run large fiscal deficits to keep the economy going. But what then happened, of course, is that after a while, as countries began to run those large fiscal deficits, they began to worry about the fact that public debt was now increasing, that private debt began to go down, but public debt went up. And then there were attempts for austerity to offset those. And what this produced was a period in the mid-2010s of very slow growth and inflation below target in the advanced economies, which was part of the background to the rise of populism with this slow growth period. So when I wrote the book in 2015 and 16, what I was very aware of in the advanced economies, within the Eurozone, within the UK, within Japan and the US, was a real challenge for a macroeconomic policy, which it seemed to be impossible to keep the economies going with sufficiently rapid in nominal demand, even to hit the inflation targets which governments had set, such as 2%. There was a fundamental problem of how do you create aggregate monetary demand, nominal demand, in a situation where there is a large private debt overhang and where there is where interest rates have reached a zero bound. And what I and others therefore ended up believing is that the Eurozone, the UK and the US had entered a situation similar to what Japan had entered after the 1990s, in which large fiscal deficits and indeed quantitative easing were a permanent feature of life. Before 1990, Japan faced an explosion of private debt to finance an extraordinary real estate boom. It then entered this process of debt overhang in the 1990s, and ever since then, it has run large public deficits because the private sector of the economy, corporate and personal together, runs large surpluses. The government side, therefore, has to run large deficits to make macro demand balance. And in order to finance that, the central bank purchases government debt in large quantities, and the Bank of Japan now owns a government debt equal to 100% of GDP. And I argued in Between Debt and the Devil in the final chapters that this would almost certainly in Japan turn out to be permanent monetary finance, that we would never see this debt sold back to the private sector, that it was essentially the central bank keeping the economy going in an environment where interest rates were ineffective, keeping it going by permanently funding large deficits. So in 2015 and 2016, when I wrote the book, what I was fascinated by was in already advanced economies with low inflation and indeed inflation below target, how do you keep the economy going in an environment where monetary policy is ineffective? And I somewhat broke a central bank and orthodox economist taboo by arguing that in those specific circumstances, you could not avoid the possibility of permanently running large fiscal deficits, which were permanently financed by central bank money. And that in those specific circumstances, that would not lead to hyperinflation, but indeed would be required to keep inflation even at the low 2% targets which central banks and governments had set. But while I was focused in the book on that conundrum of what do you do when you face this large debt overhang, I also became increasingly convinced that the causes of slow nominal demand growth and very low interest rates might be even more fundamental. And I therefore became interested, and I mentioned this in the book, and if I was to rewrite the book now, I would focus even more on the theory of secular stagnation, which people like Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary of the US, have put forward. What Larry and other economists, for instance, in a recent paper by Larry Summers and Jason Furman on a reconsideration of fiscal policy, what they have argued is that the advanced economies have entered an environment where the naturally arising balance of attempted private savings and desired private investment is such as to produce an environment of a permanent lack of adequate demand and permanently low interest rates. They, like me, have noticed that if you look not at short-term interest rates, but at long-term real interest rates in the Eurozone, in the UK, in the US, in Japan, they have been relentlessly falling from about 4% back in the 1980s to zero or negative today. And when in economics we see that sort of really long-term pattern, a fall over 30 years of a long-term real interest rates, I think we have to search for real determinants of that rather than determinants rooted in central bank policy or short-term nominal phenomena. And the explanation, which has been put forward by some very good papers by the Bank of England and by work by Larry Summers and others, is that there has been a change in the balance of ex-ante attempted savings in the world and ex-ante attempted investment, with high savings created by inequality, by structural imperfections in East Asian economies, but low investment created by the fact that on the investment side of the economy, the cost of capital goods, which are information and technology intensive, keeps on falling. And that this creates an environment where the whole world of the advanced economies may look for many decades like Japan looks, an environment where there is more attempted savings than investment on the private side of the economy, and therefore where we may have permanent public deficits, and where those public deficits may need to be, to some extent, financed by permanent quantitative easings operations, which are never reversed. I personally believe that it is highly likely that in the advanced economies we have entered not just a few more years, but possibly several decades, in which real long-term interest rates continue to be very low or even negative, in which we will see large government deficits run for many years, in which we will see quantitative easing operations which are never reversed. So that is my point of view on where we stand in the Eurozone, in Japan, in the UK, in the US. But the question for Ukraine is, what is the implications of this for a country which is not as rich as Japan or the Eurozone, and also which is mid-sized rather than continental sized? It's not as big as the Eurozone or as Japan or the US, and which has had a history in the recent past of radical monetary instability and very high inflation rates. And I think the thing that it is important to realize, and it's unfortunate, but it is a fact, is that the degrees of freedom available to a mid-sized country with that history are different from the degrees of freedom available to the US or to Japan or to the Eurozone. I think I'd like to make 2 points about the situation facing an economy like the Ukraine, attempting to grow its economy and to grow GDP per capita. Of course, it's in a different position from classic developing economies because it has in the past been quite towards the forefront of technology and development at stages in the past, but it suffered some setbacks and it now wants to grow its GDP per capita again. So it's in a different position from Korea or Japan back in the growth periods of the 60s and the 70s. It's a different development challenge, but it is a development challenge. I'd like to make some points about the microeconomy of development and the macroeconomy of a situation of a mid-sized economy. On the microeconomy, the relevant chapters of my book are chapters 7 and 8, where I talk about the ways in which countries like Japan and Korea, and more recently China, achieved rapid economic growth and technological advance. And what is interesting is that all of them in the rapid growth phases did not follow pure neoclassical, neoliberal patterns of completely free market approaches to the allocation of capital. All of them, to different extents, have directed or encouraged the banking system to invest in what they perceive as the most productive forms of innovation and technology for the future. And in the case of Japan and Korea in their periods of most rapid growth, discourage the banking system from investing in real estate. China, by contrast, faces a problem of far too much investment in real estate, with the central bank and the regulator continually trying to constrain that, but finding it difficult. But the key point I make in chapter 7 and 8 is that processes of rapid development have very rarely involved a completely free market approach to the process of capital allocation through the banking system and credit creation. They have involved some sort of mechanism for the finance ministry, the regulator, or the central bank to try to encourage the forms of credit creation and credit extension which will drive a productive investment rather than real estate speculation. And it is therefore interesting to think about what might be the lessons of that for Ukraine, about whether you can have a purely free market approach or whether you also need to use those degrees of direction and encouragement which we have seen in other successful rapid growth countries. But the second point, and what I want to end on, is macroeconomy. What is interesting about some periods of rapid growth, Korea or Japan, is that they have not been associated with very low rates of inflation. They've typically been associated not with hyperinflation, but with 6, 7, 10% inflation growth rates rather than inflation rates rather than very low growth rates. And they have sometimes been associated by macroeconomic forms of roles of the central bank, which have to a degree broken the rules against monetary finance which we now impose. With, for instance, central banks being willing to refinance a private bank extension of credit in a way which you don't so much see central banks do today, or in some cases directly funding the government to fund a productive investment. Now, of course, the moment one says that, people say, yes, but the trouble is that will lead to hyperinflation. And of course, the fundamental challenge of this issue is that on some circumstances, it does. That although I have argued that monetary finance, within carefully defined limits, can play a role in the macroeconomy, I also have to accept that there are other environments where the very fact that we admit that monetary finance is possible leads to such complete indiscipline that we have hyperinflation. And here I think is the challenge for a mid-sized economy with a history of hyperinflation. I believe that Japan can run large fiscal deficits almost forever and can use what I think will turn out to be permanent monetary finance to finance part of that. I think it will continue to buy government bonds, and the central bank will continue to buy government bonds, and those will never be sold back to the private sector. If I visited Argentina, I would tell them to be incredibly careful of doing that, or of suggesting to the external market that they are doing that. Because I think in Argentina's case, any suggestion that they were doing monetary finance would produce movements in the exchange rate, which would create inflation, which would create inflationary expectations, which would lead to all of that stimulus to nominal demand turning up in inflation rather than in real economic stimulation. So what is the difference between Japan and Argentina? Well, the difference is that Japan's process of funding its very large deficits depends on a large savings rates within the economy rather than on external finance. And so there is a difference between countries which have large fiscal deficits primarily financed internally and those which have large elements of external finance. But there is also simply a history and reputation issue. It is simply the fact that because Japan for the last 30 years has had inflation which is incredibly low or negative, people expect its inflation to be incredibly low or negative. And so when the central bank does large permanent QE operations, nobody turns that into an inflationary expectation which drives a depreciation of the exchange rate, which drives more inflation. Whereas when they face Argentina, they have a completely different set of expectations. So it is a simple fact that the degrees of freedom available for finance ministries and central banks to use some of these unconventional mechanisms of supporting investment in growth are much wider for either a Japan or indeed an America, which runs the reserve currency of the US dollar, than they are for a mid-sized country with a history of hyperinflation. I don't think that means that the degrees of freedom are nil, and I hope that my book helps think through some of the ways that Ukraine might use regulation of the banking system and the interface between the central bank and the finance ministry to support a productive investment in the real economy. But given that it is a mid-sized country with a history of very high inflation of recent history, it will do that within constraints imposed by external expectations, which are, sadly, more constraining on Ukraine than exist for instance, the US or Japan. So I hope those comments have helped stimulate some debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lord Turner. That was really fascinating, particularly the macroeconomic and the macro and the microeconomic points that you raised for Ukraine. I remember when I was reading through chapter 7 and 8, I enjoyed reading about Japan, Korea, and their experience, and I also thought it would be relevant for Ukraine, but I can't help but think, given Ukraine's weak institutions, the implementation of that would be quite difficult. So, why don't I turn the floor over to another very esteemed guest. Do we still have with us the Minister of Finance, Mr. Sергій Marčenko?
Yes, I'm here.
Mr. Marčenko, what are your thoughts about that presentation and those prescriptions from Lord Turner? And maybe you could add some of your own comments about where things are going in Ukraine for the budget for 2021 and how you're approaching some of these challenges.
Excuse me, do I need to speak English or I can speak Ukrainian? What?
However you wish.
Okay, so you have a translation, yeah?
I have a Ukrainian translation. Yes, I do.
Okay, so
An English translation. Yes. Yeah.
For a better use, I will speak Ukrainian maybe because a lot of participants are Ukrainians, that's why it's better. В першу чергу хочу подякувати за можливість поспілкуватися особисто з професором Тернером. Мені дуже цікавий цей факт, тому що свого часу, коли мені подарував книжку Віталій Ломакович, я тільки став міністром фінансів, це була перша книжка, яка з'явилася в моєму кабінеті. І тому цей факт і скажімо, меседжі, ті ідеї, які були в книжці Тернера, вони, скажімо так, були в основі моїх дискусій, які ми мали на той час з Національним банком України, які ми маємо до сих пір стосовно взаємодії фіскальної політики, взаємодії монетарної політики. Дуже часто в нашій країні вживається такий термін фіскальне домінування. На сьогодні я бачу можливо сказати, що фіскального домінування не існує, є більш сильна позиція Національного банку, який дійсно є незалежним в реалізації своєї політики. І в цьому випадку Міністерство фінансів і уряд в цілому, ми вже працюючи на ринку, працюючи в цій ситуації, яка є, вимушені яким чином реагувати на вже сталу традицію монетарної експансії, я би назвав би так. Що я маю на увазі? В першу чергу розпочну з кредитування. Ми прекрасно розуміємо, що роль Національного банку, банківської системи цілої в кредитуванні є дуже важливою. І ті стимули, і ті обмеження, які були зроблені останнім часом, дозволяють сказати, що у нас і пропозиція, і, на жаль, попит на кредити є досить низьким, що виявляється в зниженні кредитування економіки в цілому. У зв'язку з цим Міністерство фінансів на початку року було запроваджено механізм підтримки кредитування, компенсації частини відсоткових ставок, так звана програма 5.7.9, яка дозволила нам за рахунок компенсації відсоткових ставок теж підігріти ринок кредитування в цілому. І результат цього ми вже видали 14 мільярдів гривень кредитів. Це незначна сума, але порівнюючи з цілому кредитуванням і з новими кредитами, ця сума є досить суттєвою. Крім того, нами було запроваджено механізм портфельних гарантій, що також був досить новим для вітчизняної теорії фінансів банків. На жаль, він зараз поки що тільки в процесі запровадження, кінець року ми тільки його запроваджуємо. Є сподівання, що це також дасть можливість простимулювати банківську систему в частині видачі нових кредитів, і держава знову ж таки буде гарантувати частину портфеля до 70% і виконувати Міністерство буде, ми вважаємо, не зовсім властиву на роль стимулювати банківське кредитування і стимулювати вкладання коштів в економіку. Крім того, ми передбачаємо розвиток іпотечного кредитування. Знову ж таки, тут буде створено інститут, буде передбачати стимулювання ринку іпотечного кредитування. І знову ж таки, тут роль Міністерства фінансів є важливою і домінуючою. Це з одного боку ми показуємо, яким чином ми намагаємося стимулювати банківське кредитування і в цілому розвиток ринку кредитів. В частині боргів і запозичень ми досить обмежені в наших можливостях В першу чергу через те, що ринок досить зарегульований. Попит на, особливо це зараз відчувається на облігації внутрішні Міністерства фінансів є досить незначний, при тому, що відсоткові ставки є досить високі. Для прикладу, за трьохмісячними інструментами при обліковій ставці 6% і при інфляції 2,4% ми запозичуємо під 10%. Ми вважаємо цю ціну несправедливою з одного боку, але розуміючи, що це ринок, ми в принципі готові розуміти ситуацію на ринку. Нам би хотілося, звичайно, мати більш довгострокові інструменти для інвестування, щоб бути менш залежними від зовнішніх кредитів. Тому що зараз ми, як Міністерство фінансів, надзвичайно залежні від зовнішніх кредитних ресурсів. В першу чергу кредитні ресурси Міжнародного валютного фонду, далі йде макрофінансова кредитна підтримка, далі це Світовий банк. Всі інші інституційні приватні інвестори дивляться на цю комбінацію. Чи є у нас програма МВФ, якщо є, то це менша відсоткова ставка і більше можливості запозичення. Звичайно, в ситуації, коли ми маємо запроваджувати зміни антикорупційного законодавства, і це залежить вже не від Міністерства фінансів, а від парламенту, від інших організацій, інституцій, нам не хотілося б бути залежними таким чином від зовнішніх джерел запозичень. Але ми маємо те, що маємо, і в цій ситуації ми вимушені розглядати різні варіанти і комбінації. І нам би дуже хотілося б, щоб внутрішній ринок запозичень був більш розвиненим. Ми говоримо про створення вторинного ринку, і є побажання, що це так, як на даному етапі це не мрія, але є побажання, щоб вторинний ринок був активним, ми могли залучати інвесторів з інших країн, які могли вкладати в наші облігації. При цьому Міністерство фінансів з метою компенсації ризиків хотіло б бути активним учасником на цьому ринку, щоб не створювати умови для можливого перегріву або відтоку інвесторів з цього ринку. Тому, повертаючись до книжки професора Тернера, я б сказав би, що ваші ідеї мають отримати більш широке розповсюдження серед професіоналів та експертів на вітчизняному ринку, тому що я вважаю, що домінування неокласичних або певним чином ліберальних ідей – це добре, але коли є дискусія між різними течіями економічної думки і різними течіями і направленнями щодо того, яким чином ми маємо формувати стратегію боргову, стратегію фінансову, фіскальну, має мати місце. Тому що нам, як Міністерство фінансів, хотілося б мати набір інструментів, а не бути в парадигмі вже усталених інститутів, усталених правил гри, яких, на жаль, ми досить обмежені в своїх можливостях. Тому наприкінці хотів сказати, що мені дуже цікаво було познайомитися з професором Тернером. Ваші ідеї нам важливі, і ми до них дослухаємося, і хотілося б їх якимось чином запроваджувати в нашу інституційну практику. Практику Міністерства фінансів, практику Національного банку, практику інших організацій, які мають бути представлені на фінансовому ринку. Ну, дякую за увагу. Мені дуже приємно долучитися до цієї дискусії. Дякую за запрошення Growford Інституту, Ломаковичу Віталію. Дякую.
Дякую вам. Thank you very much, Minister Marchenko. Lord Turner, is there anything you want to add to that?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much, Minister. Very interested in those comments. And as I was just reflecting on that, and something, Myron, that you said before, it really did crystallize how a crucial thing I think about what I'm saying in my book. and it's your phrase, Myron, about institutional weakness and strength of institutions. Essentially what I say, and therefore the absolute importance of having clear discipline frameworks for macroeconomy and strong anti-corruption and other institutions in the microeconomy. And why I say that is the following. Part of my book points out that many successful economies have diverged from the classic free market sound money model. So if you look at Japan or Korea in their most rapid growth phase, they were allocating capital in a way which was not an entirely free market approach, right? They were favoring exporters over property development. They were backing particular technology developments. So they were breaking the free market model of a completely free market approach to capital allocation on the micro side. On the macro side, they were sometimes having the central bank directly fund the banks to lend in a way which broke modern taboos of absolutely sound monetary approach and a complete unwillingness of the central bank to fund, directly fund lending or to fund the government. But what is interesting is that all of that depended on a certain amount of credibility, and that in each case there are other institutions which diverged from the classical free market sound money model and were a disaster. So, as I point out in chapter 7, Japan and Korea deliberately identify bits of their economy which they wanted to develop, particular sectors, particular industries, and they did it very effectively. And if you go to the Philippines in the 1970s and 80s, technically it did precisely the same things, but the vast majority of the money just ended up in corrupt projects which were run by President Marcos's cronies, right? So it tells you that what matters is not just the theory, the philosophy, but the actual execution. You can execute micro-industrial policies which try to favor good sectors of the economy, and you can get it right, like Korea and Japan, if you have strong institutions. But if you have a high level of corruption like the Philippines had, you can technically do exactly the same stuff, but you'll produce a misallocation of capital, not a favorable one. And similarly on the macroeconomy, it's absolutely clear that many countries today are diverging from the absolute taboo against monetary finance. I mean, let's be clear, what is happening in the US and even to a degree in the Eurozone is that the central bank, by buying government bonds, is lubricating higher fiscal deficits than would otherwise exist. So that is a breach of the taboo. But we have other breaches of the taboo in Argentina, in Venezuela, in Zimbabwe, which had to hyperinflation. And so on the macro side as well, the issue is, can you create strong enough institutions that you can diverge from the absolute taboos without overdoing it, or without the market believing that you would overdo it? So it is always a matter of the strength of the institutions and the strength of the disciplines are vital to one's ability to diverge from the neoliberal orthodoxy. If the neoliberal orthodoxy is complete free markets and a complete and utter and always separation of the central bank from the finance ministry, in order to diverge from that, you need a good institutions on the micro side to diverge from that in an effective fashion, and you need a trust in the disciplines on the macro side to diverge from that as well. So I think that issue of strength of institutions is really fundamental.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and it's a really great segue into our next discussant, Mr. Олексій Жмеринецький, Member of Parliament from the 190 electoral district in the Khmelnytskyi region. Mr. Žmerinecký is a member of the Anti-Corruption Policy Committee in the Parliament, and has done. I think that it's a great segue into him. So the floor is yours, Олексій.
Дякую всім. Я також буду українською, так як в першу чергу, я думаю, цей захід спрямований на наших високопосадовців, на експертів, для того, щоб зламати парадигму, в якій Україна застрягла останні 10 років. Дуже хороший вийшов перехід до антикорупційної політики, але декілька слів зазначу, що ще з 2013 року я працюю в різних аналітичних центрах, які займаються саме розвитком в Україні альтернативних, скажімо, не неоліберальних інструментів економічного розвитку. В свій час ми писали законодавство щодо індустріальних парків, щодо підтримки національного виробника, щодо локалізації державних закупівель, інвестиційного банку розвитку і інших інструментів, які використовували всі країни світу, і в першу чергу сусіди України, для того, щоб розвиватися, не маючи в умовах, коли вони ще не мали реформованої, якісної інституційної системи в рамках всієї країни. Це, до речі, вже моє таке запитання до пана Тернера. До речі, книжку прочитав з захватом і думаю, що моя місія кожному парламентарю, колезі цю книжку вручити і прослідкувати, щоб він її прочитав. Так от, в умовах, коли країна, що розвивається, не має масштабної, всеохоплюючої розвиненої інституційної системи, все одно якось потрібно розвиватись, тому що виходить замкнене коло. Без грошей, без розвитку неможливо реформувати інституції, без інституцій неможливо розвиватися. Багато країн застосовували такі інструменти, як вільні економічні зони, технологічні індустріальні парки і так далі. І мені б хотілося почути коментар пана Тернера з приводу того, чи актуально це для України, і чи він розглядав для країн, що розвиваються, в якості перехідних інструментів такі механізми. З 2013 року, коли ми намагались адвокатувати цей інструмент, лобіювати ці інструменти в уряді, чи часів Януковича, скажімо так, злочинної влади нашої старої, то ми знаходили і в тій владі, скажімо, нарікання на те, що це корупційні інструменти. Україна має поганий досвід, справді, застосування цих інструментів. 2006 рік, коли спеціальні економічні зони застосовувалися для того, щоб експортувати без сплати податків окорочка, курячі. Да, і після цього ці всі зони були ліквідовані, і результатом було те, що багато інвесторів, які не ухилялись від податків, а створювали промислові підприємства, також пішли з України, тому що були порушені ті умови, на які вони прийшли, власне, в Україну працювати. От. І з уряду в уряд, зі зміною влади, все одно цей аргумент про те, що це корупційні інструменти, залишається. Особливо важко в переговорах з міжнародними нашими партнерами, кредиторами, як правильно зазначили спікери, тому що є дві такі священні корови, чи дві такі давні проблеми України. Це макрофінансова нестабільність і корупція. І виходить так, що в переговорах з міжнародними організаціями доводиться йти на поступки чи в одному, чи в іншому. І так як Україна не показує значних успіхів в антикорупційній політиці, то доводиться, по суті, погоджуватися на жорсткі монетарні і фіскальні умови, які пропонують нам міжнародні організації, щоб хоч якось убезпечити себе від неповернення, по суті, своїх запозичень. Тобто, якби, іншими словами, Україна показувала значні успіхи в антикорупційній політиці, я думаю, що це дало нам можливість вимагати чи претендувати на більші пом'якшення і поступки якраз в умовах фіскальної і монетарної політики. Мається на увазі перед нашими кредиторами. Тому до пана Тернера такі два питання. Чи розглядав він, як він ставиться до таких лайфхаків, до таких інструментів для країн, що розвиваються у вигляді спеціальних економічних зон, законів про локалізацію державних закупівель і так далі, можливо, підкаже, де знайти механізми, які убезпечать ці інструменти від проявів корупції, тому що це справді важливо. Можливо, це міжнародні наглядові ради, можливо, це якась участь міжнародних партнерів в управлінні цими інструментами. І друге, це як нам бути в цих переговорах з міжнародними організаціями, коли високий рівень корумпованості змушує нас погоджуватись на більш жорсткі фіскальні умови.
Thank you, Alexei. Lord Turner, I think that's pretty much the degrees of freedom that you're talking about. Are you with us?
Oh, hello. Do you want me to respond now?
Yeah, yes.
Oh,
Go
okay.
ahead.
I didn't know whether you wanted me to respond now.
Sure.
I mean, that was a really interesting set of comments, and I'm trying to think through my response, because I think you've gone to the absolute core of it, that in your interface with international, the IMF, other international potential funders, there is this link made between strength of anti-corruption and other forms of institutional strength and the macroeconomic disciplines. And in a sense that is bound to be the case, because what I'm suggesting is that optimal policy probably requires a greater degree of macroeconomic flexibility than the extreme orthodoxy of the past, in order to enable the sort of development policies that we saw successfully applied in some other countries, and the East Asian countries are always interesting ones to refer to, Japan and Taiwan and Korea. So they used a greater degree of macroeconomic flexibility than the IMF would typically impose today. They used it successfully, but the IMF and others are worried that if they don't impose macroeconomic discipline, that the money will be spent in a corrupt fashion. So they make that link. And as I said, if you were to look at the experience of Indonesia or the Philippines, you would think they have a justified story, because their external finance ended up in terribly wasteful projects in a way that it didn't in Korea and Japan. So I think you can see that from an international financial institution, this feels like a logical link, but one has to try to find a way whereby Ukraine can convince them that it is putting in place the strong anti-corruption mechanism so that it can have the degrees of freedom to use greater flexibility. I was thinking about the issue of localization and government procurement, and the issue which then gets us to the issue of total free trade. Because of course this is another area where there has been a neoliberal ideology which is not in line with the pattern of successful rapid economic growth developments that we've seen in the past. So the neoliberal ideology asserts that total free markets and total free trade, including no preferences for local procurement, are the way to have efficiency and therefore development. But if you actually look at Korea, Japan, they developed initially behind high tariff barriers. Indeed, that was also true of Germany in the late 19th century. The great period of German economic growth had tariff barriers, as indeed America's economic growth in the 19th century had large tariff barriers. And if you go back to the great American economic theorist and first Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, his philosophy for the development of America was absolutely not a total free trade model. So the fact is that a lot of development has had to involve a preference for local development in some way, which has been, you know, which breaks from the free market model. And it's quite interesting to look at the UK now, the UK which has been in the past an absolute sort of extremist in the free trade model. We have now left, we are about to leave the European Union. The government now has, and I strongly support this, some very strong green objectives to drive the development of our amazing offshore wind resource in the North Sea, which is one of our great resources in order to decarbonize our economy. Our Prime Minister, and I encouraged him to do this, has made a clear quantitative commitment that we will build 40 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, which is quite interesting because, you know, that's a government making a quantitative target for a particular technology, which is quite a big divergence from neoliberal theory. But the government is also trying to think about what does it do to make sure that there is as much local content as possible in the supply chain to that offshore industry. And it will use some categories of subsidies and assistance to try to build a local supply chain to develop that offshore wind development rather than leaving it to a completely free market. So that's, you know, the UK government with a conservative, market-oriented government is now talking the language of some quantitative targets and some local supply chain developments, which requires some degree of local preference. So, look, I would, if I were you, I would argue for some categories of local preference within government procurement. I think those are easier forms of divergence from free trade to justify than large tariffs, which can be a major impediment to efficiency. But if you are going to argue for that sort of localization in government procurement, you will absolutely have to convince the IMF and others that you have very, very tight anti-corruption mechanisms, because they will simply see a trade-off. I mean, the better you can make your anti-corruption mechanisms, the more that you will be able to use the tool of some government procurement local preference as a useful way of encouraging the development of Ukrainian business, including small and medium business, across many sectors of the economy. So I think we can see there that there is necessarily a link between the strength of the institutions and the anti-corruption institutions and the trust in those, and the degrees of freedom to use some of those forms of subsidy or local preference, which I think will be required to help support the development of the Ukrainian economy.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we have about 20 minutes left in our discussion, and there are a number of questions that are coming from the gallery. But before we turn over to open up the floor for questions, we do have two more questions and comments from our panel here. So let me turn the microphone over to Dr. Tetyana Bogdan, our Chief Economic Expert at Growford, and her questions or comments for Lord Turner.
Okay. Dear ladies and gentlemen, as a representative of Growford Institute, I would like to express our gratitude to Lord Turner, Mr. Marchенko, and Mr. Жмеринецький for valuable presentations and comments. And now I would like to bring up the following issue and to ask one question, Lord Turner. Lord Turner, in your book you reveal the negative implications of cross-border capital flows, among which financing excessive consumption, boom-bust cycles, and macroeconomic volatility. Over the last years, Ukraine opened its capital account and liberalized cross-border capital flows. As a result, Ukrainian residents accumulated the huge amounts of foreign assets and liabilities, and currently foreign assets in the form of deposits and foreign currency exceed 60% of Ukrainian GDP, and they represent a kind of frozen asset for a national economy that suffers from permanently low capital accumulation. Mr. Terner, do you consider a full liberalization of cross-border capital flows to be appropriate for a country like Ukraine that suffers from weak financial system and tremendous domestic investment needs? Thank you.
What a good question, and also a difficult question. I mean, what is interesting on the background of this is to go back to the Asian financial crisis of 1997 to 98. And before that crisis, there was a very strong tendency of the IMF to argue for complete and rapid liberalization of capital accounts, both long-term and short-term. Indeed, I think it was at the Hong Kong meeting of the IMF in 1997 or 8 that there was actually a suggestion of writing a short-term capital market liberalization into the Articles of Association of the IMF. And that was a sort of high point of the ideology of short-term capital liberalization, just at the point where we were realizing some of the disadvantages of it. Because what we saw, for instance, in Thailand in particular, but Thailand is probably the most dramatic, was the potentially unstabilizing impact of short-term capital flows. We saw, huge flows which rushed into those markets and drove up local asset prices. We saw also very, very dangerous forms of currency mismatch in the balance sheets of the banks. Banks which borrowed in foreign currency in dollars to lend money to real estate developments whose denomination ultimately was going to be in Thai baht, in the local currency. And when that process of inward financial flow came to an end and reversed dramatically in the course of 1996 through to 1998, this of course produced bankruptcies because they were stuck with collapsing prices of real estate loans in the local currency against foreign currency liabilities. And so out of what happened in Asia, I think a far more nuanced attitude to short-term capital flows developed and was right to develop. And even the IMF over the years has been more, open to the idea that we shouldn't open capital markets immediately or in all cases. And I refer in the book to various studies which were done, which illustrate the fact that there isn't actually much evidence of the benefit from short-term financial flows. I was just looking for the references at the moment, but I can't immediately see them. But I remember there was one from a very good Indian economist who did it, issues to do with the speed at which you can have changes in speculative flows, the difference between speculative flows and long-term flows. It's all somewhere, I can't immediately see it, in chapters 2 and 4 and 5. So I think the IMF itself has now a less ideological point of view on capital market liberalization than it did 10 or 15 years ago, and it has itself produced papers recognizing that there are those imperfections. There's also very interesting writing by the French economist Hélène Rey about the nature of global financial credit cycles and the imperfections. So, very interesting area of theory. I think one should have a non-ideological approach. What I don't know is the precise application of this to the current Ukrainian environment. What I would say is the thing that I would watch like an absolute hawk, I would watch very carefully as a central bank and a financial regulator, is the emergence of any forms of dangerous currency mismatch. You know, if you start seeing people taking out mortgages in the Ukraine denominated in euros or dollars because of low interest rates, be incredibly wary of that, because that is a financial mismatch which may look good for a period of time, but if you ever get or need to get a significant depreciation of the Ukrainian currency, that will just create a disaster. Right. And we saw that actually in Hungary and various other countries. We saw similar forms of mismatch. So be very careful of whether either corporates or residential consumers are taking on inappropriate currency mismatches. But my overall point of view would be to be very wary of flows of short-term money if that ever drove up the value of the currency. I mean, what countries like Brazil and Chile have struggled with in the past is periods of optimism and enthusiasm about their economies generating harmful appreciations of the local currency, which have undermined the competitiveness of the local industry, and then suddenly the confidence has reversed, and of course once you've lost your local industry you can't rapidly bring it back. So if you look like a country like Chile, which has very large copper reserves, and where therefore there was always a danger that the currency would fluctuate with the copper price in a very unhelpful fashion, they have over the years put in place a series of constraints against inward financial flows in order to damp that oscillation in the currency. So I'm sorry I can't go through the details of everything as it relates to the current Ukrainian situation, but certainly the experience from around the world argues for a non-ideological and careful approach to the liberalization of short-term capital flows.
Thank you. We have a few more questions here. So let me turn the floor now to Vitaly Lomacovich, and then we'll take a question from Mr. Volodymyr Panchenko. I see his hand is raised. So, Vitaly, the floor is yours.
Містер Тернер, хотів би два слова про цей дизайн, про який ви говорили, розповісти, який є в Україні, і потім задати вам коротеньке питання стосовно монетарної політики Національного банку України. Декілька макроекономічних цифр. Значить, у нас сьогодні рівень покриття кредитами ВВП складає менше 20%. Якщо відкинути непрацюючі кредити, це менше 10%. Це має на увазі корпоративний сектор до річного ВВП. Рівень інфляції складає менше 3% за 10 місяців поточного року. І облікова ставка номінальна Національного банку складає 6% річних. Нас серед економістів, людей, які представляють Національний банк, ведеться жвава дискусія про те, що Національний банк веде, на їхню точку зору, суперм'яку монетарну політику, знизивши ставку до 6% річних при річній інфляції менше 3%. І при цьому вже 3 роки він не окуповує на вторинному ринку, що принципі, дозволено законом, облігації внутрішньої державної позики Міністерства фінансів. Як ви вважаєте, чи дійсно Національний банк України проводить м'яку монетарну політику на таких ставках? І чи дійсно є зараз доцільним притримуватись єдиного таргету у вигляді низької і стабільної інфляції і нехтувати таким таргетом, як злажування шоків від пандемії COVID-19 і стимулювання економічного зростання економіки України? Дякую.
Well, it's difficult for me to comment in detail on the Ukrainian National Bank policy without going into the real details. But as you have described it, it doesn't sound like a super soft monetary policy if inflation is at 3% and the nominal interest rate is at 6%, which gives one a real interest rate of a 3%. So, you know, just as described, that sounds a reasonably disciplined approach. And of course, the government has not, the central bank has not been doing the quantitative easing operations that the central banks in the major economies of the world have been doing, and indeed which some emerging developing economies are doing. There's an interesting IMF paper out recently looking at the role of quantitative easing even in developing economies. So it sounds to me like the central bank, and I'm sure they would say that this has been necessary to squeeze inflationary expectations out of the system and to put the period of high inflation behind them, that they've been reasonably successful in that. But of course, one of the benefits of that credibility could be to give a greater degree of freedom now. I think one of the really interesting issues for a country like Ukraine is what is the optimal inflation rate? Is it as low as the 2% or lower that we see in Japan or in the Eurozone? What we've seen in many developing economies in the past, rapid growth economies, economies which are trying to grow to the top levels of a GDP per capita, is that they typically have not had inflation rates literally at 2%. Successful ones have often had inflation rates at the sort of 5-10% level. For instance, if you look at Turkey over the years, it has had reasonably rapid growth without hyperinflation, but without super low inflation. The challenge, of course, and this is the debate that is held in economics, is what is the point at which a somewhat higher rate of inflation turns into inflationary expectations and then inflation runs out of control? Whereas some economies have managed to run with inflation rates of 5 or 10% over the years, others have found that once you get to that level, it generates expectations which then multiply. But it sounds like Ukraine is well away from that, that it has ended up with quite a low rate of inflation for the current situation. I think 3% is a certainly acceptable level, and I wouldn't think there's a high priority of squeezing it down. So there is an issue of whether, if it is down at 3% and nominal interest rate is 6%, is there now enough credibility in the system to allow some more freedom at the margin on the instruments and mechanisms which are required to support investment? And there may well be. But certainly, hearing your figures of 6% nominal rates and an inflation rate of 3%, I wouldn't automatically describe that as being an ultra-soft monetary policy. That seems a reasonably robust monetary policy.
Thank you. We do have a few questions from the gallery. Mr. Marchenko, please.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Growford Institute for this breakthrough in a fight between neoliberals and industrials in Ukraine, because Mr. Terner and his book, and I hope his future studies together with the Ukrainian experts would help Ukrainian government to have the right financing possibility. We've heard Minister of Finance today. He explained about this lack of finances, but not because it is not possible. We already had the monetary fund this year to increase the budget deficit 2 times, and extraordinary possibility for industrial growth and industrial development has not yet been used because of lack of awareness of the Minister of Finance. So my question to Mr. Terner is the same as from Mr. Deputy Jmerinecki, is about institutions, but not the institutions on fighting corruption or the institutions of special regimes or some protectionist measures, but special institutions in the form of development bank on funds to use money, because Europe now has a plan of a decade of helicopter money, so Ukraine would not be able to use this possibility also in a Green Deal. You told about the UK having 40 gigawatt possibility of offshore. Ukraine has calculated 16 gigawatt of onshore wind power generation. So not to use this opportunity of Green Deal of Europe is would be a big loss for Ukraine.
Thank you.
I think this issue of development banks is a really, really important and interesting one. Because if you go back to the basic theory of the way that we create nominal demand, which can either go into consumption, or it can go into real estate speculation, or it can go into industrial development. That nominal demand can come from a number of different sources. It can come from private banks creating credit and money. But we know empirically that private banks left to themselves have an inherent tendency to fund a lot of that towards real estate construction and real estate speculation. So you have to think about whether you can get all of your development from private bank credit creation. Another way to create new demand is for governments to run fiscal deficits and to directly fund investment. And under some circumstances, if we have very low rates of inflation and interest rates are very low, that can be supported by central bank forms of quantitative easing and monetary finance. But that has the disadvantage that if there is indiscipline, it can lead to hyperinflation. And that indeed is why my book was called Between Debt and the Devil, between the disadvantages of private debt, which can be hedged towards speculation in real estate, and the devil, which in this case is a reference to the figure Mephistopheles from Goethe's Faust, who tempts the emperor to print so much money that there might be hyperinflation. That is why the book is called it, that there are disadvantages of the state creating money and there are disadvantages of purely private banks creating money. Within those two disadvantages, development banks are a very interesting alternative, because what development banks do is you create something which is one step removed from the government and the political process, and therefore you can contain or limit the danger of over-creating money, because you create a structure of how much money it can create given its capital, its discipline, but you are also able to say to it, your mandate is only to lend money for industrial development. You're not allowed to go and start lending money for residential mortgages or real estate development or real estate speculation or whatever. And that is the basic theory of development banks, and I think they are very important institutions. We in the UK are now going to set up a new national investment bank to focus on green investment to help drive the development of green investment in the UK. The European Investment Bank plays a very important role. The EBRD plays a very important role. So it may well be, I would have thought, that in the Ukrainian situation, the way to choose, as it were, the optimal path between the dangers of pure private debt and the dangers, if you get it wrong, of indiscipline in the budget, is to use a national development bank with a clear mandate and clear institutional disciplines in order to drive increased funding of industrial development and in particular green development. So certainly I think that is a very interesting area to explore.
Thank you. I'm told by the organizers we still have a few more minutes for questions. So are there any other questions from our participants? If there are, please raise your hand on the icon so we could see you. Lord Turner, how are you on time?
I'm okay. I can see one hand raised. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the name because I can't read the Cyrillic.
Yeah, he just asked the question, so we're done with Mr. Marchenko. Anybody else?
Oh, is it?
Та ми просто говорили, не бачимо.
I would like to ask the question, please.
Yeah.
My name is...
Vazhin. Is it Vaj?
Ah, Vashishin. Yes, please. Alexander Vashishin, please. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was trying to just do my imperfect reading of the Cyrillic.
Well, you did actually pretty good. That's pretty good.
Yeah. Lord Turner, I have to say that you have very good reading skills in Cyrillic. My question is like this. Given your experience, practical experience and theoretical experience, can you comment on the rising power of the modern money theory, or MMT, which is available in the English-speaking world very much, like in the US and the UK as well? Thank you so much.
Well, look, modern monetary theory is in a sense not modern. It is exactly what I refer to in this book. It is the possibility, under some circumstances, of monetary finance. And it is one of the ironies that one of the clearest statements of the possibility of monetary finance was made by Milton Friedman in an article which I refer to in the book in 1948, where he said, why do we bother with all this complicated rigmarole of central banks and finance ministries and interest rates, etc. If we want to grow the economy, why doesn't the fiscal authority directly issue money? If it wants to grow nominal GDP by, say, 4% per annum, maybe with 2% real growth and 2% inflation, and therefore probably if we assume that there's got to be a stable relationship of money stock to money income over time, a stable velocity of circulation of money, why doesn't it each year, and if that ratio is 1-to-1, why doesn't it each year run a fiscal deficit of 4% of GDP, all of which is financed by printing money, and then there'll just be, the money stock will grow by 4%, nominal GDP will grow by 4%, and it will all be completely stable. And that isn't some crazy, you know, socialist, some ultra Keynesian, that is Milton Friedman, 1948. And the whole of the essence of monetary theory is in, paradoxically, Milton Friedman. Now, so, and in a sense, what my book was saying, without calling it modern monetary theory, is there are some circumstances where you can do that. But what I then go on to say, and I said this in a paper that I delivered to the IMF, what's called the Jacques Polak Monetary Conference in November 2015, I presented a paper called Monetary Finance, an essentially political issue. And what I meant by that is that the basic theory that you can, under some circumstances, do monetary finance, and that under some circumstances it will be beneficial and help stimulate the economy, is absolutely clear and relatively easy to describe, and it is described in Milton Friedman. But the difficult issues are the political issues. It's how do you accept that we can do monetary finance while maintaining discipline about not doing monetary finance to excess? If a small amount of monetary finance would be good, how do you make sure that you can tell politicians that without politicians believing that they can then do limitless amounts of monetary finance? That's why it's an essentially political issue. Now, what happened in a lot of countries is that the resolution of this political issue was to create a taboo. It was to say, we find it so difficult institutionally to stop using monetary finance to excess that we will create a taboo whereby we must never use it. It's almost as if, you know, some people who smoke have the discipline to stop smoking 20 cigarettes a day, but once a month to smoke a nice cigar because they like smoking a nice cigar. But other people find that if they want to stop smoking to excess, the only way is to convince themselves that they must never ever touch another cigarette ever in their life, even though one cigarette wouldn't give you lung cancer. And so sometimes in life, where there is a danger that something is addictive, we find that the only way to break the addiction is to have a total taboo against it. But modern monetary theory points out that there are some circumstances where monetary finance might be beneficial. I think what I disagree with some of the people who support modern monetary finance is I find that they fail then to engage with the political question of how you discipline it, right? How you use it in a disciplined fashion. And I think there is a legitimate fear that some of the proponents of monetary theory, you know, simply think that they have discovered a limitless and magic money tree that you can use limitlessly. The crucial point about modern monetary theory is you can use monetary finance in a disciplined fashion, in a small amount, in specific circumstances, in a beneficial effect. If you use it in excess, you will destroy its benefits and produce disadvantages. And so you need a political and institutional theory. And the political and institutional theory of how to use it well is actually far more difficult than the pure economic theory, which tells you that it is possible under some circumstances.
Thank you. We have actually two more questions. We'll go with Mr. Žmerinecký and then Mr. Proshkin, and then we'll have to end it, unfortunately, because we're running out of time.
У мене дуже коротке питання до вас, пане Тернер. Я дуже вдячний Інституту Growford за те, що вони переклали вашу чудову книжку, яку я вже сказав, зобов'язуюсь розповсюдити серед депутатів. І в продовженні цієї традиції переводу тих книжок, яких не вистачає українським політикам, істеблішменту для того, щоб змінювати, вдосконалювати, розвивати свої погляди, я хотів би вас запитати, можливо, ви порадите книги ваших колег, однодумців в розширення, розвиток цієї теми, які б інститут міг перекласти. Ми були б дуже вдячні.
Any recommendations?
Well, okay, very quickly, there are in the book a set of references which are often quite classic references, in the sense of they are books and articles written 70 or 80 or 100 or more years ago. Because what I actually found when I looked at these issues is that a lot of modern macroeconomics had got so wrapped up in sophisticated mathematics and models that it was no longer thinking clearly about the essential nature of credit and money. So some of the things that I found most useful to read were a book by a Swedish economist called Knut Wicksell, Prices and Interest, written in 1904, because he thought about where did money come from. And I also read and I reference articles both by John Maynard Keynes, the Treatise on Money, and by And what is interesting in that is that most people think of John Maynard Keynes and Friedrich von Hayek as at polar opposites in the debate about economic theory. But I actually found that they had thought more deeply about the nature of credit and money than most modern macroeconomics. In the final chapter, well, the epilogue, I reference an article written in 2009 by Professor Willem Buiter, a Dutch economist who was also on the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, and he called his article on the unfortunate uselessness of most state-of-the-art academic monetary economics. And his argument was that most modern analysis had just got so wrapped up in the maths that we could no longer see things clearly. So yes, there are particular articles in here, and I would encourage you to have a look at Wicksell, have a look at Keynes, have a look at Hayek, have a look at early Friedman, but also have a look at Hyman Minsky. Hyman Minsky's writings on the fundamental instability of private credit, I think, are fundamental. And the other big thing that we did before 2008 is we created this absolute taboo against governments creating too much debt and central banks financing government debt. That was the thing you weren't allowed to do at all. And we completely ignored the fact that the private debt creation process could create problems. And in fact, the 2008 crisis was a crisis entirely to do with things that went wrong in the private sector of the economy. It wasn't a crisis at all driven by irresponsible governments borrowing too much or central banks allowing inflation to get out of control. It was a problem entirely on the private banking side of the economy. And the person who had written about that, but who had been almost entirely ignored, was Hyman Minsky.
Very good. Thank you for those recommendations. Wrapping it up, I would like to turn the floor to my colleague, Mr. Victor Proshkin, who is the Executive Director of Growford Institute. The floor is yours, Victor.
Чуєте? Доброго дня. Шановні колеги, я б хотів, по-перше, всім подякувати за таку можливість отримати переклад цієї книги лорда Едеіра Тернера в Україні. І за те, що ми сьогодні мали унікальну можливість почути, скажімо так, зірку фінансової, наукової думки, тому що сьогодні на цьому майданчику зустрілися і науковці, і члени уряду. У нас був міністр фінансів, він також, Сергій Марченко, хочу подякувати за те, що він до нас приєднався, і члени українського парламенту безпосередньо в інституті на майданчику пан Олексій Жмеринецький, який також представляє ту інституцію, яка має впливати на довіру до української влади. Це комітет по боротьбі з корупцією. І тут, знаєте, дуже важливо в сенсі нашої дискусії, щоб ми все ж таки відновили довіру між багатьма інституціями. От сьогодні, наприклад, бракувало дискусії з боку Національного банку, і цієї дискусії і взаємодії, напевно, і не вистачає для врегулювання тих перекосів в монетарній політиці, які, в принципі, є, скажімо так, основою того, що не вистачає країні економічного розвитку, тому що не вистачає грошей, і гроші не йдуть в економіку. І тому, звичайно, що Україна знаходиться в самому центрі Європи, і вона б мала стати таким, знаєте, магнітом, зважаючи на такий географічний, людський потенціал, і притягувати до себе інвестиції. І от дуже б хотілося б якісь, щоб ви дали, скажімо так, нам настанову, якийсь останній такий рецепт, як Україні стати більш привабливою інвестиційно. Дякую.
Я, мабуть, переклад не закінчився.
Закінчився регламент?
Ні, переклад, мабуть, ще не закінчився. Mr. Turner?
Well, how can Ukraine become more attractive? Look, I don't think I know enough about the Ukraine to really advise that. I think in order to do that, I will have to visit Ukraine. So I hope when this COVID crisis is over, I will find that opportunity.
Absolutely.
I mean, obviously, Ukraine has very important resources, agricultural resources, mineral resources, but we all know that economies which grow to a high standard of living, the natural resources are not the key thing. It's about the human resources. It's about the capabilities, the entrepreneurship, the technologies, etc. I think the issue of whether you can develop a green economy is an important one, because that is a really important future step forward. And I think, I think what I understand is that Ukraine starts with, quite a high level of human capital in a technical sense, in an engineering sense, in a scientific sense, some very strong capabilities there which it has to build on. So it's interesting. Look, I'm going to have to think about that earlier. I'm going to have to avoid that question because it does require an understanding of what the sources of industrial competitive advantage are, which I currently lack.
Well, let me, in summing up, let me just say that I think that your, Lord Turner, your prescriptions and your identification of the key issues, the fundamental issues, are so clear that you really have to be blind not to notice them. So thank you for that, and thank you for reorienting us through your book and through the discussion today to those fundamentals to allow us to think clearly about the path forward to some of the issues that Ukraine is facing and that some of us are facing in our work, whether it be in the think tank community, in the government, in the parliament, etc. So we sincerely appreciate the time and the effort that you've given us, and if I wish we could do a round of applause. But thank you, and thanks for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in Kiev soon.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a very enjoyable discussion, and thank you for going ahead with the translation of the book. It's a fantastic thing to see. Thank you.
You should receive your copy shortly. So thank you very much, and everybody have a great day.